In the sprawling ranchlands of Montana, where fortunes are built on blood and soil, Clayton Stone rules his empire with calculated precision and a frozen heart. His vast wealth keeps him isolated in his mansion, where even the morning sun seems to shy away from his cold demeanor. But among the staff who tend to his world, there's Sarah Mitchell, a maid whose quiet strength and gentle wisdom have gone unnoticed for far too long. She sees past his walls, past the stern businessman, to the wounded soul beneath. When violence threatens everything he's built, it's Sarah who risks it all to warn him, setting in motion a chain of events that will thaw the ice around his heart. But can a man who's spent decades pushing everyone away learn to let someone in? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn crept across the Montana sky, painting the Absaroka Range in shades of amber and rose. Clayton Stone stood at his study window, watching his empire come alive beneath the rising sun. The leather-bound ledger on his mahogany desk lay open, its precise columns of numbers a testament to his meticulous nature. Every dollar accounted for, every transaction recorded in his steady hand. At precisely 6 o'clock, the sound of quiet footsteps in the hallway announced the arrival of his household staff. Clayton didn't turn around. He knew it would be Sarah Mitchell, starting her day as she had for the past 5 years, silent, efficient, invisible. The subtle scent of fresh coffee drifted through the air as she placed his morning cup on the corner of his desk, careful not to disturb the meticulously arranged papers. "The quarterly reports are filed by date, Ms. Mitchell," he said, his voice as crisp as his starched collar. "I trust you'll remember that when you clean today." He didn't mention how she'd misplaced one folder yesterday, his first criticism of her work in months. "Yes, Mr. Stone." Her voice carried neither offense nor apology, just quiet certainty, like mountain streams that carved their paths through stone, not with force, but with persistent patience. Clayton finally turned, catching only a glimpse of her grey uniform as she slipped from the room. Something in her measured grace made him pause, but he pushed the thought aside. There was work to be done. The Stone Ranch spread across 20,000 acres of Montana's finest grazing land. From his window, Clayton could see the morning crew heading out to check the herds. Small figures on horseback, dwarfed by the landscape but moving with purpose. Each one had their assigned tasks, their designated routes: order, structure, control. He settled into his leather chair, drawing the ledger closer. The morning light caught the silver at his temples, highlighting the distinguished features that made him look every inch the successful rancher. At 48, Clayton Stone had built an empire that was the envy of every cattleman in 3 states. The hard lines around his mouth and the steel in his grey eyes spoke of the price he'd paid for that success. The sound of a door closing somewhere in the mansion echoed through the halls. Sarah would be organizing the day's staff, ensuring the massive household ran as smoothly as his business operations. She had a way of managing things that required minimal input from him, a quality he appreciated without acknowledging. Clayton reached for his coffee cup, pausing as his fingers touched the warm porcelain. The temperature was perfect, as always. Sarah knew how long to let it cool before bringing it to his study. 5 years of silent observation had taught her his preferences better than he'd ever articulated them. Outside, the sun continued its ascent, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. The gardeners would be arriving soon, maintaining the ordered beauty that surrounded the mansion. Everything in its place, every person playing their role in the carefully orchestrated symphony of wealth and power that Clayton had composed over the decades. He opened his email, scanning through the messages with practiced efficiency. Market, reports, cattle prices, weather forecasts, the daily litany of information that kept his empire running. A message from his ranch manager caught his attention. Problems with the Henderson property line again. Clayton's jaw tightened. The Hendersons had been a thorn in his side since he'd purchased the adjacent land 3 years ago. The soft sound of Sarah's cart moving down the hallway provided a counterpoint to his thoughts. She would be cleaning the library now, dusting the leather-bound books he rarely read, preserving the appearance of cultured wealth that his position demanded. Sometimes, in moments like these, Clayton caught himself wondering about her, the way she moved through his world like a shadow, changing things so subtly he almost didn't notice. Almost. He returned to his ledger, pushing away the unwelcome intrusion of curiosity. Sentiment was a luxury he'd forsaken long ago, trading it for the cold comfort of success. The empire he'd built left no room for warmth, no space for wondering about quiet maids with knowing eyes. Besides, he had more pressing concerns. The Henderson situation would need handling, and Clayton Stone had not maintained his position by showing weakness. He reached for his phone, ready to set in motion the machinery of his influence. In the hallway, Sarah's cart squeaked softly as she moved to the next room, maintaining the order of his world with each careful touch. Sarah Mitchell's hands moved steadily over the library shelves, her cleaning cloth gathering dust from leather-bound volumes whose spines had rarely been cracked. Through the tall windows, morning light caught the motes she disturbed, dancing like gold in the air. She paused at a collection of Western classics, allowing herself a small smile. Clayton Stone had probably bought them for show, never knowing. They were her comfort during lunch breaks, borrowed and returned with such care he'd never noticed they'd been moved. At 43, Sarah had learned the art of moving through the world without disturbing its surface. Her grey uniform and sensible shoes were chosen to blend with the shadows. Her brown hair always neatly pinned back, her movements efficient but unhurried. 20 years of service in wealthy homes had taught her the value of invisibility. But here, in Clayton Stone's mansion, she'd perfected it into an art form. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 8, its deep chimes echoing through the massive house. Sarah mentally tracked Clayton's movement through his morning routine. He would be heading to the ranch office now, his coffee cup empty, his ledger tucked under his arm. Right on schedule, his footsteps crossed the foyer below. Ms. Mitchell. His voice carried up the stairs, unexpected enough to make her pause. The Henderson file seems to be missing from my desk. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, picturing the layout of his study. Check the left drawer, sir. You placed it there yesterday after your phone call with the lawyers. She kept her voice neutral, though she'd seen the tension in his shoulders when he'd made that call. A moment of silence, then the sound of a drawer opening. So I did. No, thank you, but she hadn't expected one. His footsteps resumed their path to the door. Sarah returned to her dusting, but her mind worked steadily behind her calm exterior. The Henderson situation was worse than Clayton let on. She'd heard enough snippets of conversation, seen enough legal documents while cleaning, to know that much. The neighboring rancher was pushing for water rights that could cripple the Stone. Rancher's eastern pastures. The morning sun warmed her face as she moved to the windows. Below, ranch hands moved purposefully across the grounds, their routines as carefully choreographed as any ballet. Clayton's influence was evident in every precise movement, every scheduled task. Yet Sarah had noticed the subtle undercurrent of worry in their conversations lately, the way they glanced at the eastern fence line during their rounds. She pulled her small notebook from her pocket, not the official cleaning schedule she kept for show, but her personal record of the house's rhythms. 5 years of observations filled its pages. Clayton's habits, his preferences, the subtle signs of his moods that no one else bothered to notice. Today she noted the Henderson file, the tension in Clayton's voice, the increased activity near the eastern border. The sound of horses drew her attention back to the window. Clayton was mounting his stallion, his posture military straight as he guided the horse toward the east pasture. Sarah watched him go, noting how solitary he looked against the vast Montana landscape. For all his wealth and power, Clayton Stone was a man alone, wrapped in layers of isolation as thick as the winter ice on the mountain lakes. From her vantage point, Sarah could see most of the ranch spread out below. The mansion sat like a crown. On the highest point of the property, overlooking the empire Clayton had built through sheer force of will, an empire he defended with cold precision, never realizing that its greatest threats might come from the walls he'd built around his own heart. She returned her notebook to her pocket and moved on to the next room, her routine as unchanging as Clayton's. But where his rigidity came from a need for control, hers came from years of learning to read the currents that ran beneath the surface of wealthy households. Here, in this house of hard angles and cold success, those currents were shifting. Sarah felt it in the air like the first tremors before an avalanche. Something was coming. She'd seen enough of life to recognize the signs, and enough of Clayton Stone to know he wouldn't see it until it was too late. Unless, perhaps, someone who watched from the shadows chose to step into the light. Sarah straightened a cushion, adjusted a curtain, and moved quietly on with her work. Some battles were won with wisdom rather than wealth, with patience rather than power. She'd learned that lesson long ago, watching the mountains slowly reshape themselves through the patience of wind and rain. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, carried up the long driveway by Miguel, one of the younger ranch hands. Sarah watched from the upstairs window as he dismounted, his usual easy smile replaced by something more uncertain. The envelope he clutched wasn't the usual business mail that arrived at the mansion. It was a plain white envelope, unmarked except for Clayton Stone's name written in block letters. Sarah's instincts, honed by years of reading the subtle languages of wealthy households, prickled with unease. She made her way downstairs just as Miguel handed the envelope to Mrs. Peterson, the housekeeper, who would ensure it reached Clayton's desk. But something in Miguel's expression made Sarah pause in the hallway. "Everything all right, Miguel?" she asked quietly, once Mrs. Peterson had gone. The young man glanced around before answering. "Found it stuck to the fence post by the east pasture, Miss Mitchell, near Henderson's property." He twisted his hat in his hands. "There's been talk among the hands. Strange vehicles parked along the road at night. Lights where there shouldn't be any." Sarah nodded, keeping her face composed even as her concern deepened. "Thank you for letting me know." She touched his arm gently. "Be careful out there." Later, as she cleaned Clayton's study, always at 4 o'clock, when he was in his afternoon meetings, she saw the letter opened on his desk. Years of discretion warred briefly with necessity before she allowed her eyes to scan the contents. The words made her blood run cold. "Your father knew when to sell. Too bad his son isn't as smart. Last chance, Stone." The paper trembled slightly in her hand as she set it back exactly as she'd found it. Through the window, she could see Clayton in the distance, riding the fence line with his foreman. From here, he looked invulnerable, a king surveying his domain. But Sarah knew better. She'd seen the slight tremor in his hand some mornings, the way he pressed his fingers to his temples when he thought no one was watching. That evening, as sunset painted the mountains in deep, purple shadows, Sarah heard raised voices from Clayton's study. The Henderson situation had escalated. Water rights were only the beginning. Through the partly open door, she caught fragments of conversation between Clayton and his lawyer. "Can't prove anything without. My land, Thompson, I won't. Be threatened." "Careful, Clayton. These people—" Sarah moved quietly past, her mind working. Clayton Stone's empire was built on control, on careful planning and cold precision. But there were things even he couldn't control, threats that wouldn't be contained by legal documents or stern warnings. The next morning she placed his coffee on his desk as usual, but this time she spoke. "Mr. Stone." She waited until he looked up, his grey eyes sharp with irritation at the break in routine. "The east pasture roses need attention. I thought you should know. Some of them seem to have been damaged recently." Clayton's expression didn't change, but Sarah saw his fingers tighten slightly on his pen. "The gardens aren't your concern." "Ms. Mitchell." "No, sir." She held his gaze for a moment longer than usual. "But I've noticed things often look clearer from the upper windows, especially at night." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps at this deviation from their carefully maintained distance. For a moment, the mask of the stern rancher slipped, revealing a glimpse of uncertainty. Then it was gone, replaced by his usual, cold authority. "That will be all." Sarah nodded and left, knowing she'd done what she could. The warning had been delivered, wrapped in the language of roses and windows. Whether Clayton Stone would hear the truth beneath her careful words remained to be seen. That night, as she prepared to leave for her small cottage on the edge of the property, Sarah saw lights moving in the east pasture. She stood at her window for a long time, watching the distant flames of what could only be cigarettes glowing in the darkness. In the mansion above, a single light burned in Clayton's study. For the first time in 5 years, their vigils aligned. Though neither knew, they watched the same shadows creeping across the land. Clayton stood at his study window well past midnight, his mother's old silver watch heavy in his palm. The east pasture lay quiet now, but Sarah's words about the roses echoed in his mind. 20 years of building his empire had taught him to recognize warnings, even when they came wrapped in the gentle observations of a housekeeper. A soft knock at the door broke his reverie. Sarah stood in the doorway, a cup of chamomile tea on her serving tray. She'd never brought him tea this late before. "I thought you'd gone home, Miss Mitchell." His voice carried less of its usual frost. "The upstairs windows needed cleaning, sir." She set the tea on his desk, and he noticed her hands were red from the cold. The night air makes the glass clearer. Clayton looked at her then, really looked, perhaps for the first time. The silver in her brown hair caught the lamplight, and her eyes held a steady wisdom that made him wonder how much she truly saw from those upstairs windows. "You saw something." It wasn't a question. "3 men, sir. They crossed the east fence. Line an hour ago. Jake, your night watchman, he's got a bad knee. Can't make the full rounds as quick as he should." She paused. "But you knew that already." Clayton's fingers tightened around his mother's watch. He had known about Jake's knee, had seen the old ranch hand struggling to complete his patrol. But he'd ignored it, telling himself that loyalty mattered more than efficiency. Now that choice might cost him. "Why are you still here, Miss Mitchell?" She met his gaze without flinching. "Same reason you are, Mr. Stone. Some things need watching." The simple truth in her words cracked something in his carefully maintained facade. Clayton sank into his chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 48 years. The watch in his hand had belonged to his mother, Catherine Stone, who died, defending this land from another kind of threat, the bank that had tried to seize it after his father's death. She'd worked herself to exhaustion keeping the ranch, sacrificing everything to preserve Clayton's inheritance. "My mother," he found himself saying, "she used to watch from these windows too." The words surprised him as they left his mouth, a piece of personal history he'd never intended to share. Sarah's expression softened almost imperceptibly. The rose bushes were hers, weren't they? The ones by the east fence. Clayton nodded, remembering Catherine Stone's hands, always scratched, from tending her beloved roses. She said beauty had its own kind of strength. He gave a bitter laugh. "Not much beauty in spreadsheets and legal documents." "No, sir," Sarah agreed quietly. "But there's strength in knowing when to look up from them." Their eyes met again, and Clayton felt an uncomfortable shift in his worldview. This woman, who moved so quietly through his house, had been watching, understanding, protecting in her own way. While he'd been focused on his ledgers and contracts, she'd created a network of observation that rivaled his security systems. A distant sound caught their attention, the crack of a branch, perhaps, or something more deliberate. Sarah moved. To the window, her movement sure despite the late hour. "The Hendersons' blue truck," she murmured. "Parked just beyond the property line. Been there 3 nights this week." Clayton joined her at the window, close enough to catch the faint scent of lavender that always seemed to follow her. Together, they watched the distant shape of the truck, its outline barely visible in the moonlight. "How long have you been keeping these vigils, Miss Mitchell?" "Since the first threat came, sir. 5 weeks ago." She turned to face him, and Clayton was struck by the quiet strength in her bearing. A good house runs on observation. Your mother understood that. The mention of his mother again should have angered him. Personal remarks from staff usually did. Instead, he felt something shift, like ice beginning to crack under spring sun. "It's late," he said finally. "You should go home, Miss Mitchell." "Yes, sir." She moved toward the door, then paused. "The tea helps with sleep, Mr. Stone, even if you don't believe in such things." After she left, Clayton stood at the window for a long time, the tea growing cold on his desk. In the distance, the Hendersons' truck eventually pulled away, but his thoughts remained on the woman who had appointed herself guardian of his realm, watching over it with the same quiet dedication his mother once had. He lifted the teacup, surprised, to find it still warm enough to drink. It tasted of chamomile and honey, his mother's remedy for sleepless nights. Clayton wondered how Sarah had known that, then realized she must have learned it the same way she learned everything, by paying attention to what others overlooked. The morning Sarah found Clayton Stone, clutching his chest in his study. The autumn wind was rattling the windows like angry fists. She'd come in earlier than usual, troubled by the previous night's events. Another threatening letter had appeared, this one nailed to the main gate. The sight of him stopped her in the doorway. Clayton Stone, always so rigidly composed, was bent over his desk, his face ashen, his normally pristine silver hair damp with sweat. The ledger lay open before him, numbers blurring as his hand trembled against the polished wood. "Mr. Stone?" Her voice cut through his labored breathing. His head snapped up, pride warring with pain in his eyes. "I'm fine, Miss Mitchell," but his words were thin, strained, like fence wire pulled too tight. Sarah set down her cleaning supplies and moved to his side, ignoring his attempt to wave her away. "Your medication, sir, where is it?" The shock in his expression would have been amusing under different circumstances. "How did you—" "Top right drawer," she finished, already reaching for it. "Behind your father's old pocket watch. I clean. This study every day, Mr. Stone. Did you think I wouldn't notice?" His resistance crumbled as another wave of pain hit. Sarah's steady hands found the nitroglycerin tablets, her movements sure and practiced. She'd watched her own father suffer. Similar attacks years ago, before heart disease claimed him. The memories guided her now as she helped Clayton take the medication. "Small sips," she murmured, holding a glass of water to his lips. "Breathe slowly." Her free hand rested lightly on his back, feeling the expensive fabric of his suit jacket damp with fear sweat. Gradually, his breathing steadied. Color crept back into his face, though his hands still trembled slightly. Sarah maintained her quiet support, neither hovering nor withdrawing, simply present as the medication did its work. "How long have you known?" he finally asked, his voice rougher than usual. 3 years. She straightened his collar with gentle efficiency. "Since I found the first prescription bottle while dusting." "You hide them well, but prescriptions leave paper trails." Clayton's laugh was bitter. The great Clayton Stone, laid low by a faulty heart. The irony wouldn't be lost on the Hendersons. "No one else knows," Sarah said quietly. "I've made sure of that. When the pharmacist delivers your medication, it comes through me. The empty bottles disappear with my cleaning supplies. Your secret is safe." He studied her face, searching for something. Pity, perhaps, or the gleam of potential blackmail. He found neither, only the same steady presence that had marked her years of service. Why? The question seemed to surprise him as much as her. Sarah's hand rested briefly on his shoulder. "Because some battles aren't meant to be fought alone, Mr. Stone, no matter how strong the fortress." She felt him stiffen under her touch, old defenses rising, but the walls weren't as solid as before. The morning's vulnerability had carved new cracks in his armor. "The threats," he said suddenly, "they're getting worse. The Hendersons want more than water rights now. They want the whole east section, claim it was promised to their grandfather decades ago." His hand moved unconsciously to his chest. "I can't show weakness, not now." "Strength takes many forms," Sarah replied, moving to open the heavy drapes, letting in the morning light. "Your mother understood that." Maybe it's time you did too. Clayton watched her, really watched her, as she moved around his study with familiar ease. How many mornings had she been here, quietly maintaining his world while he battled his own body's betrayal? How many nights had she kept silent vigil, guarding not just his property, but his dignity? Ms. Mitchell. He waited until she turned, to face him. Sarah, thank you. Her name felt foreign on his tongue. When had he last used it? But the smile that touched her eyes made something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with his heart condition. Rest, Mr. Stone, she said, softly. I'll tell Mrs. Peterson you're taking calls in the study today. No one will disturb you. As she left, Clayton noticed she'd arranged his medicine bottle, a fresh glass of water, and his morning coffee in a neat triangle on his desk. The coffee was at the perfect temperature, as always. Such a small thing, yet it spoke volumes about the quiet care that had surrounded him, unnoticed all these years. The changes came slowly, like spring thawing frozen ground. Clayton began finding notes on his desk, not Sarah's usual cleaning schedules, but careful observations written in her neat hand. Jake's replacement, Tommy, completed the night rounds in half the time. Miguel spotted unusual tire tracks by the East Creek. Small things, vital things, that his formal reports often missed. One morning he arrived in his study to find a new addition, a pair of binoculars, old but well-maintained, placed carefully beside his coffee cup. They were my father's, Sarah explained when he questioned her. She was adjusting the curtains, letting in the peculiarly clear light of a Montana autumn. He used them for bird-watching, but they work just as well for watching other things. The upper windows have the best views of the east pasture. Clayton lifted the binoculars, feeling their worn leather and solid weight. The gesture wasn't lost. On him, Sarah Mitchell didn't seem to do anything without careful purpose. Your father, he said, turning them over in his hands. He taught you to watch. He taught me to see. She moved to the window, her reflection ghosting against the morning sky. There's a difference. Below, the ranch was coming alive with its usual precision. But Clayton noticed things now that he'd overlooked before. How the younger hands always seemed to find work near Miguel, learning from his quiet expertise. How Mrs. Peterson arranged the staff schedules to pair experienced workers with newer ones. A whole network of silent teaching and learning that hummed beneath the surface of his carefully ordered world. The Henderson boy was watching the house. Again last night, Sarah said, her voice pulling him from his thoughts. Young Tim, the one with the limp. He's not like his uncle. There's worry in his eyes, not threat. Clayton joined her at the window, raising the binoculars. Through them, he could see the distant figure of Tim Henderson riding along the fence line, his posture speaking of uncertainty rather than challenge. You think he knows something? I think he's afraid, Sarah replied. Fear makes people choose sides, Mr. Stone. Sometimes not the ones you'd expect. The wisdom in her words struck him, echoing his mother's old sayings about knowing the difference between enemies and frightened friends. Catherine Stone had built relationships while his father built fences. Looking back, Clayton wondered which had better served the ranch. A knock at the door interrupted his reflection. Mrs. Peterson entered, her usually composed face tight with concern. Mr. Stone. The hands found something in the east pasture. Miguel asked specifically for you to come see. Clayton reached for his coat, then paused, looking at Sarah. Would you come with me, Ms. Mitchell? Your eyes might see what mine miss. The surprise that flickered across her face was quickly masked, but her nod held a warmth he'd never noticed before. Together they walked down to where Miguel waited, his weathered face grave beneath his hat brim. The discovery was worse than Clayton had feared. Several fence posts cut nearly through, weakened but left standing. A trap waiting to spring, designed to look like natural wear until cattle pressed against it. The potential loss of livestock would have been devastating. Maria, my sister who works at the Henderson place, Miguel said quietly. She overheard. Plans, Not from Tim, but the others. They're planning something big, Mr. Stone. Clayton felt the familiar pressure in his chest begin to build, but Sarah's presence beside him helped steady his breathing. She moved forward, examining the cut posts with careful attention. "Look here," she said, pointing to marks in the soil. "Whoever did this stood and watched the house for a while. They're sending a message. They'll find I don't respond well to threats," Clayton said, but the old cold fury in his voice had been replaced by something more measured. Sarah straightened, brushing dirt from her skirt. "No, Mr. Stone. But perhaps it's time to send a message of our own, one that speaks of strength and wisdom both." She glanced at Miguel, who nodded slightly, understanding passing between them. Clayton watched this silent exchange, suddenly aware of how much of his ranch's true strength lay not in his rigid control, but in these quiet alliances, these careful observations shared among people he'd barely noticed before. Like his mother's roses, beauty and strength could grow in unexpected places if one knew how to nurture them. The confrontation came on a day when the sky hung low and heavy with unshed snow. Clayton had been reviewing water rights documents when Frank Henderson's truck roared up the drive, spitting gravel. From her position upstairs, Sarah watched 3 men emerge. Frank Henderson himself, his brother James, and their lawyer, a thin man whose suit spoke of city money. She was already moving before Mrs. Peterson's hurried knock at Clayton's study door. "Mr. Stone." "I see them," Clayton said, his voice steady, despite the tension Sarah could read in his shoulders. Their eyes met briefly as she entered, and something passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of shared vigilance. "Stay," he said quietly, surprising them both. It wasn't a command, but a request. The Hendersons burst in without waiting for an invitation, bringing with them the cold smell of approaching winter and barely contained violence. Frank's weather-beaten face was flushed with more than just the wind. "You've gone too far this time, Stone," he spat, slapping a paper down on the desk. "Cutting off our water access in winter?" Clayton remained seated, his composure a stark contrast to Henderson's rage. "Your cattle broke through to my water reserves 3 times this month, Frank. The new fence is a reasonable precaution." "Reasonable." James Henderson stepped forward, his bulk threatening in the confined space. "Those springs have been shared for generations. My grandfather—" "Your grandfather," Clayton interrupted, his voice like ice, "never owned that land. The deed is quite clear." Sarah moved quietly to the window, positioning herself where she could see both the study door and the trucks outside. Young Tim Henderson was still in the lead vehicle, his face a mask of anxiety as he watched the house. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Mr. Stone, my clients are prepared to take legal action. The historical precedent won't hold up in court," Clayton finished. "As you well know, Mr. Thompson, the water rights were legally transferred with the land deed in 1987. Frank." Henderson's face darkened. His hand twitched toward his jacket pocket, and Sarah saw Clayton tense slightly. But it was James who moved first, stepping aggressively toward the desk. "Legal rights don't mean much out here, Stone. You've forgotten how things work in Montana. How accidents can happen." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Sarah watched Clayton's hand move instinctively toward his chest, and she knew she had to act. "Mr. Stone," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "The sheriff's car just turned onto the drive. Should I have Mrs. Peterson delay him?" All eyes turned to her. Through the window, Sarah could see only empty road, but her words had the desired effect. The Hendersons shifted uneasily, and their lawyer tugged at his collar. Clayton's eyes held a glimmer of understanding. "No, Miss Mitchell. Show him in when he arrives. I'm sure Sheriff Burke would be interested in this conversation." Frank Henderson backed away from the desk, his rage tempered now by caution. "This isn't over, Stone. That water is our lifeline." "Then perhaps," Sarah spoke again, surprising herself, "you gentlemen should consider Mr. Stone's original offer, the one about sharing maintenance costs for a regulated access point." The silence that followed was deafening. Clayton's face showed. No surprise at her knowledge of private negotiations, but the Hendersons stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. "The lady has a point," the lawyer said carefully. "A regulated access point would protect everyone's interests. And prevent accidents," Sarah added softly, her eyes meeting James Henderson's. The tension slowly bled from the room. Frank Henderson straightened his jacket, dignity warring with pragmatism. "We'll consider it. Have your lawyer draw up the papers." After they left, Sarah and Clayton stood in silence, watching the trucks retreat down the drive. Snow had begun to fall, soft flakes that promised to erase all traces of the confrontation. "There was no sheriff," Clayton said finally. "No, sir." Sarah moved to adjust the curtains. "But there could have been. Threats work both ways, Mr. Stone." He studied her with new eyes. "You knew about the access point offer. From the documents? From Tim Henderson, actually. He talks to Maria in town, Miguel's sister. He wants peace, not war." She paused. "Sometimes the quietest voices have the most to say." Clayton nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. While he'd been building walls, Sarah had been building bridges, invisible but crucial connections that might just save more than water rights. "Thank you," he said simply, and they both knew he meant for more than just today's intervention. The betrayal revealed itself on a bitter December evening, hidden in the innocent pages of Clayton's accounting ledger. Sarah had been organizing his desk, a task that had become more intimate since his heart episode, when she noticed the discrepancy. Small adjustments in the fence repair costs, subtle enough to escape casual notice, but forming a pattern that made her blood run cold. "Mr. Stone needs to see this," she murmured, reaching for the ledger. A floorboard creaked behind her. "Ms. Mitchell." Robert Walsh's voice froze her in place. "Working late again, I see." Clayton's accountant of 15 years stood in the doorway, his familiar round face somehow different in the fading light. Sarah's hand remained on the ledger, her fingers pressing against the damning evidence of his betrayal. "The quarterly reports needed organizing," she said carefully, buying time. Clayton was at the Henderson property, finalizing the water access agreement. Too far to hear any call for help. Walsh stepped into the study, closing the door behind him. "You've always been too observant for your own good, noticed things you shouldn't." His hand slipped into his jacket pocket. "The Hendersons paid well for those notices about Stone's movements, but this," he gestured to the ledger, "this was my retirement plan." Sarah's mind raced. The pieces fell into place, the strategic timing of the threats, the inside knowledge of Clayton's vulnerabilities. "The heart medication," she said softly. "You made sure they knew about that too. Had to prove my worth." Walsh's smile didn't reach his eyes. "But now we have a problem, don't we?" Sarah heard the threat in his voice, saw the subtle shift of his weight toward her. In one fluid motion, she swung the heavy ledger at his face and bolted for the door. Walsh's. Hers followed her into the hallway. Sarah ran, her sensible shoes silent on the thick carpet. The mansion's familiar corridors felt endless now, shadowed and strange. Behind her, Walsh's heavier footsteps echoed her flight. She reached the back stairs, the servants' route she'd walked thousands of times. But as she started down, Walsh's voice came from above. "Need some help here." "She's stolen documents. Stop her." A door opened below. Sarah heard Mrs. Peterson's startled exclamation, saw the housekeeper's confusion as Walsh's words registered. That moment of hesitation was all Sarah needed. She pushed past, clutching the ledger to her chest. "The safe!" she gasped as she passed. "Mrs. Peterson, call Mr. Stone." Outside, the winter air hit her lungs like needles. Sarah ran toward her cottage, knowing Walsh would expect her to head for the main gate. The snow had started again, thick flakes that would cover her tracks, if she could make it far enough. A shot cracked through the evening stillness. Sarah felt something hot graze her arm, heard Walsh's frustrated shout behind her. She stumbled, but kept running, her world narrowing to the next step, the next breath. Her cottage appeared through the swirling snow, a dark shape in the gathering night. But safety lay in the opposite direction. The old rose garden where Catherine Stone's Prized flowers still bloomed in season. Sarah forced herself to think like Clayton, to see the tactical advantage. The garden's high walls and dense bushes offered coverage, and more importantly, clear sightlines to anyone approaching. She reached the garden's iron gate just as headlights swept the drive. Clayton's truck fishtailed to a stop, and she saw him emerge, his face a mask of controlled fury. Behind her, Walsh's footsteps crunched in the new snow. "Mr. Stone!" Walsh's voice carried false concern. "Thank goodness you're here." "She's taken sensitive documents. The ledger," Sarah called out, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Show him the fence repair costs, page 43. Time seemed to stop. Clayton's eyes moved from Sarah's face to Walsh's, understanding dawning as cold as the falling snow. Walsh must have seen it too. His hand moved toward his pocket again. "Don't." Clayton's command cut through the winter air like a blade. In the distance, sirens wailed. Mrs. Peterson had understood after all. Sarah watched as Miguel and two other ranch hands emerged from the shadows, moving with quiet purpose to flank Walsh. The accountant's shoulders slumped, defeat replacing desperation. Clayton reached Sarah's side, his hand gentle on her injured arm. "You're bleeding, just a graze," she assured him, but his fingers tightened protectively. "You could have run straight to the gate," he said softly. "To safety." Sarah met his eyes, seeing in them a warmth that belied the bitter cold. "The roses." She said simply, "Your mother's roses needed protecting." Understanding passed between them, deep as winter roots and just as strong. Some things were worth risking everything for, not just ledgers and land, but the deeper treasures that love had planted long ago. The study felt different that night, transformed by the revelations of Walsh's betrayal and the weight of what was to come. Sarah sat in one of the leather chairs, a bandage bright against her arm, while Clayton paced before the fireplace. This ID ledger lay open between them, its pages telling a story of calculated deception. Walsh was feeding them everything, Clayton said, his voice tight with contained anger. "Security rotations, staff schedules, even my—" He trailed off, hand moving, unconsciously toward his chest. "Your heart condition," Sarah finished quietly. "They knew when you'd be most vulnerable." Clayton stopped pacing, turning to face her. The firelight caught the silver in his hair, the new lines of worry around his eyes. "You could have died tonight. So could you." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "That was their plan, wasn't it? Use the ledger evidence to confront you, trigger an episode, make it look natural." She swallowed hard. A man with a weak heart, faced with proof of embezzlement. "But they didn't count on you." Clayton moved closer, settling into the chair opposite her. "All these years, Sarah, you've been protecting more than just the house, haven't you?" The use of her first name hung in the air between them, intimate as a touch. Sarah looked down at her hands, remembering all the times they'd straightened his papers, measured his medication, poured his coffee just so. "Your mother once told me," she said softly, "that true strength isn't in what we guard, but in why we guard it." She glanced up, finding Clayton watching her intently. "That was my first week here." She knew she was dying, but she wanted to make sure someone understood. Understood what? That the ranch wasn't just land and ledgers. It was a legacy of care, the way she planted roses where everyone said they wouldn't grow, the way she knew every hand's family troubles, every maid's dreams. Sarah's voice grew stronger. The way she loved a son who'd forgotten how to let himself be loved. Clayton's breath caught audibly. In the firelight, Sarah could see the shimmer of unshed tears in his eyes. "The Hendersons will come," he said finally, his voice rough. "Walsh's arrest won't stop them. They'll think I'm weakened now, vulnerable. Then we show them a different kind of strength." Sarah stood, moving to the window where the snow had finally stopped falling. "Miguel's sister says there's division in their camp. Tim Henderson and several others want no part of violence. We use that." Clayton joined her at the window, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, smell the subtle cedar scent that always clung to his clothes. "You don't have to stay, Sarah." You've risked enough." She turned to face him, suddenly aware of how the years of distance had melted between them, like spring sun on winter ice. "Do you remember what you said? That first day I worked here? This house demands loyalty." "I remember thinking you wouldn't last a month," he admitted, a smile touching his lips. "You were too gentle for this place. Like your mother's roses?" Sarah's own smile held a lifetime of quiet knowing. Gentle. Things can have deep roots, Mr. Stone, strong enough to weather any storm. Clayton's hand rose, hesitating before touching the bandage on her arm. "Clayton," he said softly, "after tonight, I think you've earned the right to use my name." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken things. Then Sarah straightened, becoming practical again. "We should gather the hands you trust most, plan our defense. Tim Henderson might be convinced to help, especially if his uncle's methods have turned to violence." Clayton nodded, but his eyes remained on her face. "The house demands loyalty," he repeated thoughtfully. "But it rewards love, doesn't it? My mother knew that. You knew that. I'm only now beginning to understand." Outside, the moon broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. Sarah saw movement at the edge of the property, Miguel and his men, starting their patrols. The ranch was awakening to its own defense, like a sleeping giant rousing to protect its heart. "Come," she said, touching Clayton's arm gently. "Let's make your mother proud." Dawn brought the kind of bitter cold that made the Montana winter infamous. Sarah stood at the kitchen window, watching her breath frost the glass as Clayton briefed. The loyal ranch hands gathered around the scarred oak table. Their faces were grim in the pale morning light, each man understanding what the coming days might cost. "Tim Henderson came through," Miguel reported, his hands wrapped around a steaming coffee mug Sarah had just filled. "Called an hour ago. His uncles gathered about 15 men, planning to move at dusk. They're talking about running cattle through the east fence line, creating chaos to cover their real purpose." Clayton's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "Which is the deed to the water rights, the original one, from 1987. Miguel glanced at Sarah. "They know it's in your safe, Mr. Stone. Walsh told them everything before we took him in." Sarah met Clayton's eyes across the table, seeing in them the same realization she'd reached. "They don't know about the study renovation," she said quietly. "About the new safe behind your mother's portrait." A ghost of a smile touched Clayton's lips. "No," he agreed. "Walsh didn't know about that. Mother's little secret kept safe by her roses all these years." The ranch hands exchanged glances, years of loyalty evident in their steady gazes. These were men who'd watched Clayton grow from a cold businessman into something more, who'd seen Sarah's quiet influence reshape the heart of the ranch. They understood what was at stake was more than just water rights or land deeds. "We've got men positioned here, here, and here," Tommy said, pointing to locations on the worn map spread across the table. "Good sight lines to the east fence, but if they come in force—" "They won't expect us to be ready," Clayton interrupted, his tactical mind engaging. "Walsh's betrayal was supposed to leave us vulnerable, disorganized. Instead, they'll find us waiting." Sarah finished. She moved to the table, indicating a spot on the map. "The rose garden. It's the perfect vantage point, and they'll think it's just decorative cover. Catherine's legacy, protecting Clayton's." The men nodded, respect in their eyes. They'd long since stopped seeing her as just the housekeeper. Now she was as much a guardian of the ranch as any of them. "Maria says Tim's convinced 3 more of Henderson's men to stand down," Miguel added. "They don't want blood on their hands." "But Frank Henderson—" He shook his head. "The man's desperate. Losing the water rights means losing his ranch, and he blames you, Mr. Stone." "Blame doesn't matter now," Clayton said, standing to study the map more closely. His shoulder brushed against Sarah's, and neither moved away. "What matters is protecting what's ours. All of ours." A truck's engine rumbled. In the distance, Sarah moved back to the window, raising the binoculars that had become an extension of her watchfulness. "Sheriff's deputy," she reported, Coming up the north road, Clayton straightened, authority settling over him like a familiar coat. Miguel, get the men to their positions. Tommy, make sure the horses are ready if we need them. The rest of you know what to do. The kitchen emptied quickly, leaving Sarah and Clayton alone in the pale winter light. She could see the weight of responsibility in the set of his shoulders, the worry line between his brows that hadn't been there a week ago. Your medication, she reminded him gently. You'll need to stay calm when they come. Calm. His laugh held no humor. They threaten my ranch, my people. His voice softened. They hurt you. Sarah touched his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. And now they'll learn what it means to threaten something protected by both roses and thorns. She reached into her pocket, withdrawing a small key. I'll move the deed to the new safe. They'll waste precious time on the old one. Clayton caught her hand before she could turn away. Sarah. His voice was rough with emotion. If anything happens, it won't, she said firmly. Catherine Stone didn't raise a son who would lose his ranch to bullies. And I didn't spend 5 years watching over this place to see it fall now. Their eyes held for a long moment. Words, unspoken, but understood, hovering between them. Then Sarah squared her shoulders and moved toward the study, her practical shoes silent on the wooden floors. Outside, the winter sun cast long shadows across the snow, like nature itself was drawing. Battle lines across the land they both loved. They came at dusk, just as Tim had warned. Sarah watched from the rose garden as headlights cut through the gathering darkness, a ragged line of trucks and ATVs breaking from the tree line. The winter air carried the sound of engines and men's voices, harsh against the pristine silence of the snow-covered land. 15 vehicles, she murmured into the radio Clayton had insisted she carry. Frank Henderson's in the lead. Clayton's voice crackled back, steady and sure. Miguel's men are in position. Remember, stay hidden until... The rest of his words were lost in a sudden explosion of sound. Cattle burst through the east fence, exactly as predicted, their panic orchestrated by Henderson's men. Sarah's fingers tightened on her father's binoculars as she watched the chaos unfold. But something was wrong. The cattle drive was too obvious, too messy. Through the lens, she caught a flash of movement near the old barn, 3 figures moving with purpose toward the house's rear entrance. Clayton, she whispered urgently into the radio, they're splitting up. The cattle are a diversion. They're heading for the kitchen door. His response was immediate. I see them. Stay where you are, Sarah, please. She knew that tone, the one that meant he was about to do something both brave and foolish. Clayton, wait for backup. Your heart... But she could already see him moving across the snow-covered ground, a shadow among shadows. Sarah bit back a curse that would have scandalized Mrs. Peterson. The roses surrounding her seemed to share her anxiety, their bare branches, glicking together in the bitter wind. The next few minutes unfolded like scenes from a nightmare. Sarah watched helplessly as Clayton confronted the intruders, his voice carrying clearly across the frozen ground. That's far enough, Frank. Frank Henderson's response was a wild rush forward. The 2 men collided as Sarah was already moving, her body acting before her mind could catch up. She heard Miguel shouting orders, saw ranch hands emerging from their hiding places, but her focus was entirely on Clayton. He was holding his own against Frank, years of ranch work evident in his strength. But then James Henderson appeared from behind the barn, and Sarah saw the metallic glint of a weapon in the fading light. Behind you, she screamed, breaking cover. Clayton spun, but not fast enough. The pipe James wielded caught him in the side, driving him to his knees. Sarah saw his hand clutch his chest, saw the pain contort his features, and her world narrowed to a single point of focus. She reached them just as James drew back for another swing. Without hesitation, Sarah swung the heavy binoculars, catching him squarely in the jaw. He stumbled backward, shock replacing rage on his face. That's enough, Tim Henderson's voice rang out across the yard. He appeared with Miguel and 3 other men, all armed with ranch rifles. Uncle Frank, stop this madness. But Frank Henderson was beyond reason. He lunged for Clayton again, only to find Sarah standing between them, her father's binoculars raised, like a shield. "He's having a heart attack," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Is this what you want, Frank? To kill a man over water rights? To destroy two families' legacies in one night?" The words seemed to penetrate Frank's fury. He looked at Clayton, gasping on his knees in the snow, then at his own brother lying dazed on the ground. The fight drained from him like water through cupped hands. "Get your uncle out of here, Tim," Sarah ordered, never taking her eyes off Frank. "Take him home. We'll talk tomorrow, when cooler heads prevail." She didn't wait to see if they complied, turning instead to Clayton. His face was ashen, his breathing labored, but his eyes were clear as they met hers. "The medication," he managed between gasps. "In my pocket." Sarah's hands were steady as she helped him with the nitroglycerin tablet, cradling his head against her shoulder. Around them, she was dimly aware of Miguel's men securing the scene, of Tim Henderson leading his family away, of the cattle being rounded up in the distance. "You never listen," she murmured, feeling his breathing slowly steady, charging in. Like some night in a Western novel, Clayton's laugh was weak but genuine. "Learned from the best. Watching you, with those binoculars." "Hush." She held him closer, feeling his heart gradually return to its normal rhythm. Catherine always said the strongest flowers grow in difficult soil, but she never mentioned how stubborn they could be. In the growing darkness, surrounded by the winter bare roses his mother had planted, Clayton Stone reached up to touch Sarah's face. "Not stubborn," he whispered, "just well-tended." The doctor insisted Clayton remain in bed for a week, a sentence he bore with all the grace of a caged mountain lion. Sarah moved her duties to his bedroom suite, converting the sitting room into a temporary office where she could monitor both his health and the ranch's operations. "The Henderson situation is resolved," she reported on the third morning, adjusting his pillows with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. "Tim came by earlier with signed agreements. They're accepting your original water-sharing proposal, with additional terms for maintenance costs." Clayton watched her move around the room, noticing how the morning light caught the silver strands in her hair. "You negotiated those terms." Someone had to. She paused by the window, where a vase of winter roses from the greenhouse filled the room with their subtle fragrance. Frank Henderson's pride needed a gentle hand. His nephew helped him understand that survival doesn't always mean winning. "Like someone else I know," Clayton said softly. When Sarah turned to look at him, he added, "My mother would have handled it the same way." The comparison brought a soft flush to her cheeks. Catherine was a wise woman. She moved to check his medication schedule, her hand brushing his as she reached for the chart. Neither pulled away immediately. "Tell me about her," Clayton said suddenly. "About the things I was too blind to see when she was alive." Sarah settled into the chair beside his bed, her practical skirt arranging itself with unconscious grace. "She loved watching the sunrise from your study, said it reminded her that every day brings a fresh chance to do things right." Her eyes grew distant with memory. "The day she hired me, she took me to the rose garden, told me roses need 3 things to thrive: strong roots, regular tending, and someone who sees past their thorns to their potential for beauty." She was talking about me, wasn't she? She was talking about love. Sarah's voice was gentle, the kind that's patient enough to wait for winter to pass, the kind that sees strength in vulnerability. Clayton reached for her hand, and this time she let him take it. Her fingers were warm against his, marked with the honest calluses of work. "I've been a fool, Sarah." "No," she corrected softly. "You've been hurt. There's a difference." Her free hand moved to smooth back his silver hair, the gesture achingly tender. "Your father's death, your mother's illness. You built walls to protect yourself, but walls can keep out more than pain. They couldn't keep you out." Her smile held years of quiet knowing. "I had practice with stubborn things. Roses, remember? The moment stretched between them, comfortable as an old quilt. Outside, they could hear the normal sounds of ranch life resuming, horses in the stable, men calling to each other across the yard, the distant lowing of cattle. The empire Clayton had built continued to turn, but somehow its importance had shifted, realigned around the woman who'd tended its heart in silence for so long. "The hands have a pool going," Sarah said after a while, amusement touching her voice. "About how long you'll actually stay in bed. What did you bet? That you'd try to escape to your study today?" She gave him a knowing look. "Miguel saw you testing your strength earlier." Clayton had the grace to look sheepish. "The ranch is in good hands." She squeezed his fingers gently. "Miguel knows his work. Mrs. Peterson runs the house like a well-oiled machine. And She hesitated. I'm exactly where I need to be." The simple truth in her words wrapped around his heart like a warm blanket. Clayton tugged gently on her hand, drawing her closer to the bed. "Sarah Mitchell," he said softly, "how long have you been loving me?" Her free hand came up to cup his cheek, her touch as natural as breathing. "Since I first saw past the thorns," she whispered, "since I understood that the strongest hearts are often the ones that have weathered the most storms." In the gentle morning light, surrounded by the scent of winter roses, Clayton Stone finally stopped fighting the spring thaw that had been warming his frozen heart. When he pulled Sarah down for their first kiss, it felt like coming home to a place he'd never known he'd been seeking. Spring came early to the Stone Ranch that year, as if nature itself was celebrating the changes taking place. Clayton stood at his study window, watching Sarah move through the rose garden below. She was consulting with the gardeners, her practical work clothes a sharp contrast to the elegant business suit she'd worn to yesterday's ranch management meeting. "The men respect her," Miguel had said that morning, delivering his weekly report. "They always did, but now it's different. She sees things we miss, thinks 3 steps ahead, like your mother did." Clayton smiled at the memory. Catherine Stone would have appreciated the symmetry, another strong woman helping to guide the ranch's future, but this time with her son's full partnership and trust. "The irrigation plans are ready for review," Sarah said from the doorway, bringing Clayton back to the present. She crossed to his desk with the familiar grace that had captivated him for so long, though now she carried herself with a new confidence. No longer the invisible housekeeper, but his equal in all things. "The Henderson partnership working out?" he asked, drawing her close as she spread the plans before him. "Better than expected. Tim's influence has been crucial. His uncle's, actually. Listening to new ideas now that the old wounds are healing." She leaned into him slightly, a casual intimacy that still thrilled him. Their foremans coming by later to discuss the shared maintenance schedule. Clayton studied the irrigation plans, noting how they integrated both properties' needs while preserving the natural flow of the land. It was the kind of solution that looked obvious in hindsight, but required both wisdom and patience to achieve. Much like their relationship, he mused. Mrs. Peterson's been dropping hints about redecorating. "The master suite," Sarah mentioned, amusement coloring her voice. "I think she's tired of bringing your morning coffee to 2 different rooms." Subtle as always, our Mrs. Peterson. Clayton turned to face Sarah fully, taking in the laugh lines around her eyes, the silver threading through her dark hair. "Would that be something you'd consider, making it official?" Sarah's smile held the warmth of 1,000 Montana sunrises. "I thought you'd never ask. I should have asked years ago." His hand found hers, their fingers intertwining naturally. "If I hadn't been so—" "Shh." She pressed a finger to his lips. "The past is like winter ground. We don't dig it up. We plant new things and wait for them to grow." From the yard below came the sound of ranch hands preparing for the day's work, but the atmosphere was different now, more laughter, more casual conversation. The rigid hierarchy Clayton had maintained for so long had softened under Sarah's influence, like frost giving way to spring rain. "The hands are taking bets again," she told him, eyes twinkling, "about whether we'll have the wedding in the rose garden. Where else?" Clayton pulled her closer, breathing in the lavender scent that had become as essential to him as air. Mother's roses have watched over us this long. Seems only right they should witness this too. Sarah reached up to straighten his collar, a gesture unchanged from their years of careful distance, but now her touch lingered, intimate and sure. Speaking of witnesses, Tim Henderson asked if he could attend. Said something about wanting to see the proof that miracles still happen in Montana. Miracles? Clayton raised an eyebrow. The notorious Clayton Stone, known for his cold heart and iron will, finally melted by love. Her teasing held no sting, only joy. Though I prefer to think of it as good gardening, patience, attention and faith in what lies dormant beneath the snow. Clayton's laugh was interrupted by a knock at the door. Miguel entered, his weathered face bright with news. The first foals of the season just arrived, sir. Twin fillies, strong and healthy. We'll come see them, Sarah said, already reaching for her jacket. She caught Clayton's questioning look. The books can wait. Some moments need to be witnessed firsthand. As they walked to the stables, Clayton marveled at how naturally Sarah's arm fit through his. How right it felt to move through his world with her beside him. The ranch hands tipped their hats with knowing smiles, and even the morning sun seemed to shine with extra warmth on the couple. "You've changed everything," he murmured as they neared the stable. Sarah's answering smile held all the wisdom of her years of patient waiting. "No, my love, I just helped you remember who you were always meant to be. The rest was already there, waiting to bloom." The morning of the Henderson Stone water rights signing brought the kind of perfect Montana spring day that seemed designed by Providence. Sarah stood in what was now their study, adjusting Clayton's tie with practiced hands, while sunlight streamed through windows that no longer needed to serve as watchtowers. "Frank Henderson called earlier," she said, smoothing the silk beneath. Her fingers. "He wanted to make sure we're still including that clause about educational partnerships with the local schools." Clayton covered her hands with his own, still marveling at how natural such gestures had become. "Your idea was brilliant, you know, teaching the next generation about sustainable ranching, water conservation." He smiled. Mother would have loved it. She already had the idea. Sarah nodded toward Catherine's portrait, now hanging beside the new safe. "I found her old journals in the attic last week. She'd drafted similar plans, but the timing wasn't right back then, and now it is." Clayton drew her closer, inhaling the familiar lavender scent that had become as much a part of his home as the leather of his ledgers. "Because of you." The sound of vehicles approaching drew them to the window. The Hendersons' trucks were rolling up the drive, but this time they brought no threat, only the promise of a new chapter in both ranches' histories. Through the morning mist, Sarah could see Tim Henderson helping his uncle from the passenger seat, the older man's proud bearing softened by recent events. "Ready?" she asked Clayton, noting how he stood straighter now, his authority stemming from confidence rather than cold control. "With you beside me? Always." They met their guests on the front steps, where Mrs. Peterson had outdone herself arranging morning refreshments. The tension of past months had dissolved into something more complex, not quite friendship yet, but a shared understanding of what really mattered in the vast Montana landscape they all called home. Sarah. Frank Henderson extended his hand, humility sitting strangely but sincerely on his weathered features. "That garden classroom idea you proposed? My granddaughter can't stop talking about it. Says she wants to learn about roses now." "Catherine Stone would have been delighted to hear that," Sarah replied warmly. "She always said good things grow better in shared soil." The signing ceremony took place in the study, where morning sun fell across the polished desk that had once served as a barrier between Clayton and the world. Now it brought people together, supporting the weight of new agreements and fresh starts. As the lawyers handled the final details, Sarah watched Clayton interact with the Hendersons, seeing how naturally he'd adapted to this new way of leadership. His questions were thoughtful, his suggestions collaborative. The ice that had encased his heart for so long had melted into streams of possibility, nourishing everything they touched. "Miss Mitchell, Mrs. Stone, I mean," Tim Henderson corrected, himself with a smile. "Would you consider serving on the Joint Water Management Committee? We could use your perspective." Before Sarah could respond, Frank Henderson added his voice. "The woman who took down my brother with a pair of binoculars? I'd say that's exactly the kind of clear-sighted thinking we need." Laughter filled the study, genuine healing laughter that seemed to make the very walls breathe easier. Sarah caught Clayton's eye across the room, seeing in his proud smile all the love that had grown between them, cultivated through years of patient tending. Later, after the documents were signed and their guests had departed, Clayton and Sarah walked through the rose garden. Spring buds were beginning to show their colors, promising beauty to come. "I had Miguel post the new job listings," Clayton said, his arm warm around her waist. "Ranch Education Coordinator, Community Relations Manager. Positions your research showed we needed, and the scholarship program. Approved by both boards, 2 students per year, alternating between the Henderson and Stone ranches." He stopped to brush a tender kiss across her temple. "Your vision for this place, it's like you can see straight into the future." Sarah touched a promising rosebud, feeling its potential beneath her fingers. "I just see what's already there, waiting to grow, like someone else I know taught me to do." From the main house came the sounds of ranch life continuing, phones ringing, staff moving purposefully through their day, the distant buzz of educational tours being organized. The empire Clayton had built was transforming into something greater, a legacy of learning, cooperation, and shared prosperity. "We should tell them soon," Sarah said softly, her free hand drifting to her middle where their newest secret was just beginning to show. Clayton's breath caught as he covered her hand with his. "Mother's roses will have another generation to watch over, and this one will grow up knowing all the kinds of strength there are," Sarah promised, leaning into his embrace as the Montana spring bloomed around them, full of possibilities they would nurture together. The rose garden had never looked more alive than it did the week before the wedding. Sarah stood among Catherine Stone's beloved flowers, now in full summer bloom, while Mrs. Peterson fussed with fabric swatches and seating arrangements. The entire ranch had thrown itself into the preparations with an enthusiasm that touched Sarah deeply. "Miguel's wife finished the altar decorations," Mrs. Peterson announced, consulting her ever-present notebook. "Used those wild Montana roses you love mixed with Catherine's heritage blooms. Says it represents both sides of the ranch's heart coming together." Sarah smiled, one hand resting unconsciously over the gentle swell of her stomach, their secrets still hidden beneath carefully chosen clothes. "It's perfect, though I think you've all gone above and beyond what we planned." "Nonsense." Mrs. Peterson's usually stern face softened. 5 years we've watched you tend this place, and him, with more care than any of us knew how to give. This celebration isn't just about a wedding, it's about family finally finding its way home." From the main house came the sound of hammering, as ranch hands transformed the great room for the reception. Clayton had suggested a larger venue in town, but Sarah knew better. This place, this land, was woven into the fabric of their love story. It deserved to witness their joy. "The Hendersons confirmed their coming," Mrs. Peterson continued. "All of them, even Frank. Tim's bringing his new fiancée. Says you two inspired him to stop waiting for the perfect moment and make his own happiness." Sarah touched a perfect rose, remembering other moments in this garden. Midnight vigils, quiet victories, the first time Clayton had kissed her among these very blooms. "Sometimes the perfect moment finds you," she mused. "You just have to be patient enough to recognize it." "Like someone else I know." Clayton's voice came from behind them, warm with affection. He joined them among the roses, nodding respectfully to Mrs. Peterson before drawing Sarah close. "The hands want to know if you'll approve their surprise before the ceremony." "Surprise?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "They've been working on it for weeks." very secretive. His eyes crinkled with amusement, though Miguel did mention something about your father's old binoculars being involved. Mrs. Peterson excused herself discreetly, leaving them alone in the summer morning. Clayton's hand found Sarah's, resting together over their growing child. Having second thoughts about such a public celebration, he asked softly, knowing how she'd always preferred to work quietly behind the scenes. No, she answered truthfully. This isn't just our moment. It's everyone's. The ranch hands who stood by us, the Hendersons choosing peace over pride, your mother's legacy blooming all around us. She gestured to the garden. Love isn't meant to be kept hidden. You taught me that. I taught you? Clayton's laugh held wonder. My love, you're the one who taught me everything worth knowing about love. I just had to be stubborn enough to finally learn. They walked together through the garden paths, reviewing the wedding preparations. Everywhere they looked, they saw evidence of the community's involvement. The stable boys had crafted wooden signs with quotes about love and growth. The cook's daughters had pressed flowers from Catherine's garden to decorate the table settings. Even the Henderson ranch had contributed, sending over their prized draft horses to pull the vintage carriage Sarah would ride in. Oh! Sarah stopped, suddenly pressing Clayton's hand. Feel the babies moving. Clayton's face transformed with joy as he felt their child stir. Strong, like its mother, he murmured, and loving, like its father, she countered gently. The way you are now, the way you were always meant to be. They paused by the garden's eastern edge, where the first roses Catherine had planted still bloomed faithfully each year. The morning sun caught the dew on their petals, turning them to living gems. I used to stand here, Sarah admitted, in those early years, watching you in your study, wondering if you'd ever see past your ledgers and walls to what was growing all around you. Clayton drew her closer, his strength now gentled by understanding. I see it now, the beauty, the potential, the love that was there all along. He touched her face tenderly. And soon everyone else will see it too. No more hiding, no more waiting, just us growing together. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the summer morning, its song carrying across the ranch that had transformed from a cold empire into a warm home. In the distance, they could hear the happy sounds of preparation continuing, their ranch family working together to celebrate not just a union, but the blossoming of something beautiful that had been years in the growing. 1 year later, Clayton stood in his mother's rose garden, holding his infant daughter, while Sarah conducted a tour for the newest group of agricultural students. Catherine Rose Stone, named for both her grandmother and the flowers that had helped bring her parents, together reached out with tiny fingers toward the blooms that were her namesake. And these heritage varieties, Sarah was explaining to the attentive group, were first planted by Catherine Stone Sr. over 30 years ago. They demonstrate how dedication and proper care can help something not just survive, but thrive. In even the harshest conditions. Clayton smiled, recognizing the deeper wisdom in her words. The students, a mix of Henderson and Stone Ranch scholarship recipients, were taking careful notes. Among them was Frank Henderson's granddaughter, her eyes bright with the same passion for learning that Sarah brought to everything she touched. Mr. Stone, the young girl raised her hand. Could you tell us about how the water sharing initiative changed ranching in the valley? Clayton shifted little Catherine in his arms, joining the group. Actually, that's a story about more than just water rights. It's about understanding that true strength often comes from cooperation rather than competition. He exchanged a warm glance with Sarah. Sometimes the best business decisions aren't found in ledgers and contracts, but in listening to the wisdom of those who see with their hearts as well as their eyes. The morning sun caught the silver in Sarah's hair as she took their daughter, settling her naturally against her hip while continuing the lesson. The sight still caught Clayton's breath. His two Catherines, embodying everything good that had grown from the soil of his former coldness. The Joint Education Center opens next month, Sarah reminded the students. We'll be offering hands-on experience in sustainable ranching practices, water conservation, and yes, She smiled at Frank Henderson's granddaughter, Rose Cultivation. Because every skill worth having takes patience, dedication, and faith in what's possible. Later, after the students had gone, Clayton found Sarah in their study. She was updating the ranch's new mission statement, their daughter sleeping peacefully, in the antique cradle they'd discovered in the attic. The room had changed over the past year, warming with family photos and children's artwork from the community programs. Yet Catherine's portrait still watched over it all, her gentle smile seeming to approve of every change. The Henderson partnership. Numbers came in, Sarah said, looking up from her work. The shared resources have increased productivity on both ranches by 30%. But more importantly, she handed him a different report. The community impact statistics are even better. Higher education rates, increased local employment, stronger family farms. Clayton set aside the papers to lift his sleeping daughter out from her cradle. Mother always said the land would tell us what it needed, if we just learned to listen. He cradled Catherine gently. She would have loved seeing her roses teaching new generations about growth and patience. She sees. Sarah moved to join them by the window. Through the programs we've built, through the lives we're touching, through her granddaughter's eyes, she touched the baby's soft cheek. Catherine Rose will grow up knowing all kinds of strength, the kind that builds walls and the kind that knows when to replace them with bridges. Outside, the ranch hummed with purposeful activity. The education center was nearly complete, its architecture blending seamlessly with the natural landscape. Young interns worked alongside experienced hands, learning not just ranching techniques, but the deeper wisdom of the land. Even the Hendersons' blue truck was parked in the drive, Tim and his new wife having stopped by to discuss expanding the youth program. "Did you ever imagine this?" Clayton asked softly. "Back when you first came here when I was—" He trailed off, remembering his former self with a mix of regret and understanding. "I imagined you," Sarah said simply. "The real you, waiting beneath the frost like winter roses. Everything else," she gestured to their transformed world, "grew naturally once that thaw began." Little Catherine stirred in her father's arms, her eyes blinking open to reveal the same warm brown as her mother's. Clayton held his family close, watching the Montana summer light paint their world in hues of possibility. The empire he'd built with cold precision had transformed into something far richer, a legacy of love, learning, and growth that would flourish long after the original roses had faded. "My 3 Catherines," he murmured, "teaching me new kinds of strength every day." Sarah's kiss held the warmth of 1,000 Montana sunrises. "And we're just getting started, my love. Just getting started." In the heart of Montana, where fortunes are still built on blood and soil, the Stone Ranch stands as a testament to love's transformative power. Clayton and Sarah Stone work side by side, their partnership as natural as the changing seasons. Their daughter Catherine toddles through the rose garden her grandmother planted, learning early that the strongest blooms often bear the sharpest thorns. The education center buzzes with young voices, while the Henderson Stone Water Initiative serves as a model for ranches across the state. In the study where a cold man once ruled his empire alone, 3 generations of Catherine's roses now grace the windowsill. Heritage blooms, wild Montana roses, and new hybrid varieties, each adding their own beauty to the legacy. Some say it's just good business, but those who know the story see it for what it is: love, blooming faithful as roses. In the Montana spring,